Chapter 3, Volume 1 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 2, The Massacres of the South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 2, The Massacres of the South, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 3, Part 1. Such crimes, of which we have only described a few, inspired horror in the breasts of those who were neither maddened by fanaticism nor devoured by the desire of vengeance. One of these, a Protestant Baron d'Aiguillers, without stopping to consider what means he had at his command, or what measures were the best to take to accomplish his object, resolved to devote his life to the pacification of the Cevennes. The first thing to be considered was, that if the Camisards were ever entirely destroyed by means of Catholic troops, directed by de Vainville, de Julien, and de Montrevel, the Protestants, and especially the Protestant nobles, who had never borne arms, would be regarded as cowards, who had been prevented by fear of death or persecution from openly taking the part of the Huguenots. He was therefore convinced that the only course to pursue was to get his co-religionists to put an end to the struggle themselves, as the one way of pleasing His Majesty and of showing him how groundless were the suspicions aroused in the minds of men by the Catholic clergy. This plan presented, especially to Baron d'Aiguillers, two apparently insurmountable difficulties, for it could only be carried out by inducing the king to relax his rigorous measures and by inducing the Camisards to submit. Now the Baron had no connection with the court, and was not personally acquainted with a single Huguenot chief. The first thing necessary to enable the Baron to begin his efforts was a passport for Paris, and he felt sure that as he was a Protestant, neither M. de Baville nor M. de Montrevel would give him one. A lucky accident, however, relieved his embarrassment and strengthened his resolution, for he thought he saw in this accident the hand of Providence. Baron d'Aiguillers found one day at the house of a friend, a M. de Perret, a colonel in the king's army, and who afterwards became major general, but who at the time we are speaking of was commandant at Uzes. He was of a very impulsive disposition, and so zealous in matters relating to the Catholic religion and in the service of the king, that he never could find himself in the presence of a Protestant without expressing his indignation at those who had taken up arms against their prince, and also those who without taking up arms encouraged the rebels in their designs. M. d'Aiguillers understood that an allusion was meant to himself, and he resolved to take advantage of it. So the next day he paid a visit to M. de Perret, and instead of demanding satisfaction, as the latter quite expected for the rudeness of his remark on the previous day, he professed himself very much obliged for what he had said, which had made such a deep impression on him that he had made up his mind to give proof of his zeal and loyalty by going to Paris and petitioning the king for a position at court. De Perret, charmed with what he had heard and enchanted with this convert, embraced d'Aiguillers and gave him, says the chronicler, his blessing, and with the blessing a passport, and wished him all the success that a father could wish for his son. D'Aiguillers had now attained his object, and furnished with the lucky safe conduct, he set out for Paris, without having communicated his intentions to anyone, not even to his mother. On reaching Paris, he put up at a friend's house and drew up a statement of his plan. It was very short and very clear. The undersigned has the honour to point out humbly to His Majesty that the severities and the persecutions which have been employed by some of the village priests have caused many people in the country districts to take up arms, and that the suspicions which new converts excited have driven a great many of them to join the insurgents. In taking this step, they were also impelled by the desire to avoid imprisonment or removal from their homes, which were the remedies chosen to keep them in the old faith. This being the case, he thinks that the best means of putting an end to this state of things would be to take measures exactly the contrary of those which produced it, such as putting an end to the persecutions and permitting a certain number of those of the reformed religion to bear arms, that they might go to the rebels and tell them that far from approving of their actions, the Protestants, as a whole, wish to bring them back to the right way by setting them a good example, or to fight against them in order to show the king and France, at the risk of their lives, that they disapproved of the conduct of their co-religionists, and that the priests had been in the wrong in writing to the court that all those of the reformed religion were in favour of revolt. D'Aygaliers hoped that the court would adopt this plan, for if they did, one of two things must happen. Either the Camisards, by refusing to accept the terms offered to them, would make themselves odious to their brethren, for D'Aygaliers intended to take with him on his mission of persuasion only men of high reputation among the reformers, who would be repelled by the Camisards if they refused to submit, or else, by laying down their arms and submitting, they would restore peace to the south of France, obtain liberty of worship, set free their brethren from the prisons and galleys, and come to the help of the king in his war against the allied powers, by supplying him in a moment with a large body of disciplined troops, ready to take the field against his enemies, for not only would the Camisards, if they were supplied with officers, be available for this purpose, but also those troops which were at the moment employed in hunting down the Camisards would be set free for this important duty. This proposition was so clear, and promised to produce such useful results, that although the prejudice against the reformers was very strong, Baron d'Aygaliers found supporters who were at once intelligent and genuine in the Duc de Chevreuse and the Duc de Montfort, his son. These two gentlemen brought about a meeting between the Baron and Camisard, and the latter presented him to the Marechal de Villars, to whom he showed his petition, begging him to bring it to the notice of the king. But M. de Villars, who was well acquainted with the obstinacy of Louis, who, as Baron de Pecken says, quote, only saw the reformers through the spectacles of Madame de Maintenon, told d'Aygaliers that the last thing he should do would be to give the king any hint of his plans, unless he wished to see them come to nothing. On the contrary, he advised him to go at once to Lyons and wait there for him, M. de Villars, for he would probably be passing through that town in a few days, being almost certain to be appointed governor of Languedoc in place of M. de Montrevel, who had fallen under the king's displeasure and was about to be recalled. In the course of the 3 interviews which d'Aygaliers had had with M. de Villars, he had become convinced that de Villars was a man capable of understanding his object. He therefore followed his advice, as he believed his knowledge of the king to be correct, and left Paris for Lyons. The recall of M. de Montrevel had been brought about in the following manner. M. de Montrevel, having just come to Uzes, learned that Cavalier and his troops were in the neighbourhood of Saint-Chat. He immediately sent M. de La Jonquière with 600 picked marines and some companies of dragoons from the regiment of Saint-Sernin. But half an hour later, it having occurred to him that these forces were not sufficient, he ordered M. de Foix, lieutenant of the dragoons of Fimarcon, to join M. de La Jonquière at Saint-Chat with 100 soldiers of his regiment, and to remain with him if he were wanted, if not, to return the same night. M. de Foix gave the necessary orders, chose 100 of his bravest men, put himself at their head, and joined M. de La Jonquière, showing him his orders, but the latter, confiding in the courage of his soldiers and unwilling to share with anyone the glory of a victory of which he felt assured, not only sent away M. de Foix, but begged him to go back to Uzes, declaring to him that he had enough troops to fight and conquer all the Camisards whom he might encounter. Consequently, the 100 dragoons whom the lieutenant had brought with him were quite useless at Saint-Chat, while, on the contrary, they might be very necessary somewhere else. M. de Foix did not consider that it was his duty to insist on remaining under these circumstances, and returned to Uzes, while M. de La Jonquière continued his route in order to pass the night at Moussac. Cavalier left the town by one gate just as M. de La Jonquière entered at the other. The wishes of the young Catholic commander were thus in a fair way to be fulfilled, for in all probability he would come up with his enemy the next day. As the village was inhabited for the most part by new converts, the night, instead of being spent in repose, was devoted to pillage. The next day the Catholic troops reached Moussac, which they found deserted, so they went on to Las Cours de Gravière, a little village belonging to the barony of Boucaron, which M. de la Jonquière gave up to pillage, and where he had 4 Protestants shot, a man, a woman, and 2 young girls. He then resumed his route. As it had rained, he soon came on the trail of the Camisards, the terrible game which he was hunting down. For 3 hours he occupied himself in this pursuit, marching at the head of his troops, lest someone else, less careful than he, should make some mistake, when suddenly raising his eyes he perceived the Camisards on a small eminence called Le Devoir de Méragnargues. This was the spot they had chosen to await attack in, being eager for the approaching combat. As soon as Cavalier saw the royals advancing, he ordered his men, according to custom, to offer up prayers to God, and when these were finished he disposed his troops for battle. His plan was to take up position with the greater part of his men on the other side of a ravine, which would thus form a kind of moat between him and the king's soldiers. He also ordered about 30 horsemen to make a great round, thus reaching unseen a little wood about 200 yards to his left, where they could conceal themselves, and lastly, he sent to a point on the right 60-foot soldiers chosen from his best marksmen, whom he ordered not to fire until the royal forces were engaged in the struggle with him. M. de la Jonquière, having approached to within a certain distance, halted and sent one of his lieutenants named de Saint-Chatte to make a reconnaissance, which he did, advancing beyond the men in ambush, who gave no sign of their existence, while the officer quietly examined the ground. But Saint-Chatte was an old soldier of fortune, and not easily taken in, so on his return, while explaining the plan of the ground chosen by Cavalier for the disposition of his troops to M. la Jonquière, he added that he should be very much astonished if the young Camisard had not employed the little wood on his left and the lie of the ground on his right as cover for soldiers in ambush. But M. de la Jonquière returned that the only thing of importance was to know the position of the principal body of troops in order to attack it at once. Saint-Chatte told him that the principal body was that which was before his eyes, and that on this subject there could be no mistake, for he had approached near enough to recognize Cavalier himself in the front rank. This was enough for M. de la Jonquière. He put himself at the head of his men, and rode straight to the ravine, beyond which Cavalier and his comrades awaited him in order of battle. Having got within a pistol shot, M. de la Jonquière gave the order to fire, but he was so near that Cavalier heard the words and saw the motion made by the men as they made reply. He therefore gave a rapid sign to his men, who threw themselves on their faces, as did their leader, and the bullets passed over them without doing any harm. M. de la Jonquière, who believed them all dead, was astonished when Cavalier and his Camisards rose up and rushed upon the royal troops, advancing to the sound of a psalm. At a distance of 10 paces they fired, and then charged the enemy at the point of the bayonet. At this moment the 60 men in ambush to the right opened fire, while the 30 horsemen to the left, uttering loud shouts, charged at a gallop. Hearing this noise and seeing death approaching them in 3 different directions, the royals believed themselves surrounded and did not attempt to make a stand. The men, throwing away their weapons, took to their heels, the officers alone and a few dragoons whom they had succeeded in rallying, making a desperate resistance. Cavalier was riding over the field of battle, sabring all the fugitives whom he met, when he caught sight of a group composed of 10 naval officers, standing close together and back to back, spontoon in hand, facing the Camisards who surrounded them. He spurred up to them, passing through the ranks of his soldiers and not pausing till he was within 15 paces of them, although they raised their weapons to fire. Then making a sign with his hand that he wished to speak with them, he said, "Gentlemen, surrender. I shall give quarter, and in return for the 10 lives I now spare you, will ask that my father, who is in prison at Nimes, be released." For sole answer, one of the officers fired and wounded the young chief's horse in the head. Cavalier drew a pistol from his belt, took aim at the officer, and killed him. Then turning again to the others, he asked, "Gentlemen, are you as obstinate as your comrade, or do you accept my offer?" A second shot was the reply, and a bullet grazed his shoulder. Seeing that no other answer was to be hoped for, Cavalier turned to his soldiers. "Do your duty," said he, and withdrew to avoid seeing the massacre. The 9 officers were shot. Monsieur de la Jonquière, who had received a slight wound in the cheek, abandoned his horse in order to climb over a wall. On the other side he made a dragoon dismount and give him his horse, on which he crossed the river Gardon, leaving behind him on the battlefield 25 officers and 600 soldiers killed. The defeat was doubly disastrous to the royal cause, depriving it of the flower of its officers, almost all of those who fell belonging to the noblest families of France, and also because the Camisards gained what they so badly needed: muskets, swords, and bayonets in great quantities, as well as 80 horses, these latter enabling Cavalier to complete the organization of a magnificent troop of cavalry. The recall of the Marechal de Montrevel was the consequence of this defeat, and M. de Villars, as he had anticipated, was appointed in his place. But before giving up his governorship, Montrevel resolved to efface the memory of the check which his lieutenant's foolhardiness had caused, but for which, according to the rules of war, the general had to pay the penalty. His plan was by spreading false rumours and making feigned marches to draw the Camisards into a trap in which they in their turn would be caught. This was the less difficult to accomplish, as their latest victory had made Cavalier overconfident both in himself and his men. In fact, since the incident connected with the naval officers, the troops of Cavalier had increased enormously in numbers, everyone desiring to serve under so brave a chief, as that he had now under him over 1,000 infantry and 200 cavalry. They were furnished, besides, just like regular troops, with a bugler for the cavalry and 8 drums and a fife for the infantry. The Marechal felt sure that his departure would be the signal for some expedition into the level country under Cavalier, so it was given out that he had left for Montpellier and had sent forward some of his baggage wagons to that place. On April 15th he was informed that Cavalier, deceived by the false news, had set out on the 16th of April, intending to pass the night at Caveyrac, a small town about a league from Nimes, that he might be ready next day to make a descent on La Vannage. This news was brought to M. de Montrevel by a village priest called Verrien, who had in his pay vigilant and faithful spies in whom he had every confidence. Montrevel accordingly ordered the commandant of Lunel, M. de Grandval, to set out the next day, very early in the morning, with the Charolais regiment and 5 companies of the Fimarcon and Saint Sernin dragoons, and to repair to the heights of Boissière, where instructions would await him. Sandricourt, governor of Nimes, was at the same time directed to withdraw as many men as possible from the garrison, both Swiss and dragoons, and send them by night towards Saint Come and Clarensac. Lastly, he himself set out, as he had said, but instead of going on to Montpellier, he stopped at Sommieres, whence he could observe the movements of Cavalier. Cavalier, as M. de Montrevel already knew, was to sleep on the 15th at Caveyrac. On this day Cavalier reached the turning point in his magnificent career. As he entered the town with his soldiers, drums beating and flags flying, he was at the zenith of his power. He rode the splendid horse M. de la Jonquière had abandoned in his flight. Behind him, serving as page, rode his young brother, aged 10, followed by 4 grooms. He was preceded by 12 guards, dressed in red, and as his colleague Roland had taken the title of Comte, he allowed himself to be called Duke of the Cevennes. At his approach, half of the garrison, which was commanded by M. de Maillon, took possession of the church and half of the citadel. But as Cavalier was more bent on obtaining food and rest for his soldiers than of disturbing the town, he billeted his men on the townspeople and placed sentinels at the church and fortress, who exchanged shots all the night through with the royal troops. The next morning, having destroyed the fortifications, he marched out of the town again, drums beating and flags flying as before. When almost in sight of Nimes, he made his troops, which had never before been so numerous or so brilliant, perform a great many evolutions, and then continued his way towards Nages. M. de Montrevel received a report at 9 o'clock in the morning of the direction Cavalier and his troops had taken, and immediately left Sommieres, followed by 6 companies of Fimarcon dragoons, 100 Irish free lances, 300 rank and file of the Hainault regiment, and 1 company each of the Soissonnais, Charolais, and Menon regiments, forming in all a corps over 900 strong. They took the direction of Vernage, above Clarensac, but suddenly hearing the rattle of musketry behind them, they wheeled and made for Langlade. They found that Grandval had already encountered the Camisards. These, being fatigued, had withdrawn into a hollow between Boissière and the windmill at Langlade in order to rest. The infantry lay down, their arms beside them. The cavalry placed themselves at the feet of their horses, the bridle on arm. Cavalier himself, Cavalier the indefatigable, broken by the fatigues of the preceding days, had fallen asleep, with his young brother watching beside him. Suddenly he felt himself shaken by the arm, and rousing up, he heard on all sides cries of "Kill! Kill!" and "To arms! To arms!" Grandval and his men, who had been sent to find out where the Camisards were, had suddenly come upon them. The infantry formed, the cavalry sprang up to their saddles. Cavalier leaped on his horse, and drawing his sword, led his soldiers as usual against the dragoons, and these, as was also usual, ran away, leaving 12 of their number dead on the field. The Camisard cavalry soon gave up the pursuit, as they found themselves widely separated from the infantry and from their leader, for Cavalier had been unable to keep up with them, his horse having received a bullet through its neck. Still, they followed the flying dragoons for a good hour, from time to time a wounded dragoon falling from his horse, till at last the Camisard cavalry found itself confronted by the Charolais regiment, drawn up in battle array, and behind them the royal dragoons, who had taken refuge there and were reforming. Carried on by the rapidity of their course, the Camisards could not pull up till they were within 100 yards of the enemy. They fired once, killing several, then turned round and retreated. When a third of the way back had been covered, they met their chief, who had found a fresh horse by the wayside standing beside its dead master. He arrived at full gallop, as he was anxious to unite his cavalry and infantry at once, as he had seen the forces of the Marechal advancing, who, as we have already said, had turned in the direction of the firing. Hardly had Cavalier effected the desired junction of his forces than he perceived that his retreat was cut off. He had the royal troops both before and behind him. The young chief saw that a desperate dash to right or left was all that remained to him, and not knowing this country as well as the Cevennes, he asked a peasant the way from Soudorgues to Nages, that being the only one by which he could escape. There was no time to inquire whether the peasant was Catholic or Protestant. He could only trust to chance and follow the road indicated. But a few yards from the spot where the road from Doudorgues to Nages joins the road to Nimes, he found himself in face of Marechal Montrevel's troops under the command of Menon. However, as they hardly outnumbered the Camisards, these did not stop to look for another route, but bending forward in their saddles, they dashed through the lines at full gallop, taking the direction of Nages, hoping to reach the plain round Calvisson. But the village, the approaches, the issues were all occupied by royal troops, and at the same time Grandval and the Marechal joined forces, while Menon collected his men together and pushed forward. Cavalier was completely surrounded. He gave the situation a comprehensive glance. His foes were 5 to 1. Rising in his stirrups, so that he could see over every head, Cavalier shouted so loud that not only his own men heard, but also those of the enemy. "My children, if our hearts fail us now, we shall be taken and broken on the wheel. There is only one means of safety. We must cut our way at full gallop through these people. Follow me and keep close order." So speaking, he dashed on the nearest group, followed by all his men, who formed a compact mass, round which the 3 corps of royal troops closed. Then there was everywhere a hand-to-hand battle. There was no time to load or fire. Swords flashed and fell, bayonets stabbed. The royals and the Camisards took each other by the throat and hair. For an hour this demoniac fight lasted, during which Cavalier lost 500 men and slew 1,000 of the enemy. At last he won through, followed by about 200 of his troops, and drew a long breath, but finding himself in the centre of a large circle of soldiers, he made for a bridge, where alone it seemed possible to break through, it being only guarded by 100 dragoons. He divided his men into 2 divisions, one to force the bridge, the other to cover the retreat. Then he faced his foes like a wild boar driven to bay. Suddenly, loud shouts behind him announced that the bridge was forced, but the Camisards, instead of keeping the passage open for their leader, scattered over the plain and sought safety in flight. But a child threw himself before them, pistol in hand. It was Cavalier's young brother, mounted on one of the small wild horses of Camargue, of that Arab breed which was introduced to Languedoc by the Moors from Spain. Carrying a sword and carbine proportioned to his size, the boy addressed the flying men. "Where are you going?" he cried. "Instead of running away like cowards, line the river banks and oppose the enemy to facilitate my brother's escape." Ashamed of having deserted such reproaches, the Camisards stopped, rallied, lined the banks of the river, and by keeping up a steady fire covered Cavalier's retreat, who crossed without having received a single wound, though his horse was riddled with bullets, and he had been forced to change his sword 3 times. Still the combat raged, but gradually Cavalier managed to retreat. A plain cut by trenches, the falling darkness, a wood which afforded cover, all combined to help him at last. Still his rear guard, harassed by the enemy, dotted the ground it passed over with its dead, until at last both victors and vanquished were swallowed up by the night. The fight had lasted 10 hours. Cavalier had lost more than 500 men and the royals about 1,000. Cavalier, says M. de Villars in his Memoirs, acted on this day in a way which astonished everyone, for who could help being astonished to see a nobody, inexperienced in the art of warfare, bear himself in such difficult and trying circumstances like some great general? At one period of the day he was followed everywhere by a dragoon. Cavalier shot at him and killed his horse. The dragoon returned the shot but missed. Cavalier had 2 horses killed under him. The first time he caught a dragoon's horse, the second time he made one of his own men dismount and go on foot. M. de Montrevel also showed himself to be a gallant soldier. Wherever there was danger there was he, encouraging officers and soldiers by his example. One Irish captain was killed at his side, another fatally wounded, and a third slightly hurt. Granval, on his part, had performed miracles. His horse was shot under him, and M. de Montrevel replaced it by one of great value, on which he joined in the pursuit of the Camisards. After this affair, M. de Montrevel gave up his place to M. de Villars, leaving word for Cavalier that it was thus he took leave of his friends. Although Cavalier came out of this battle with honour, compelling even his enemies to regard him as a man worthy of their steel, it had nevertheless destroyed the best part of his hopes. He made a halt near Pierredon to gather together the remnant of his troops, and truly it was but a remnant which remained. Of those who came back, the greater number were without weapons, for they had thrown them away in their flight. Many were incapacitated for service by their wounds, and lastly, the cavalry could hardly be said to exist any longer, as the few men who survived had been obliged to abandon their horses in order to get across the high ditches, which were their only cover from the dragoons during the flight. Meantime the royalists were very active, and Cavalier felt that it would be imprudent to remain long at Pierredon. So setting out during the night and crossing the Gardon, he buried himself in the forest of Huzet, whither he hoped his enemies would not venture to follow him. And in fact the first 2 days were quiet, and his troops benefited greatly by the rest, especially as they were able to draw stores of all kinds, wheat, hay, arms, and ammunition, from an immense cave which the Camisards had used for a long time as a magazine and arsenal. Cavalier now also employed it as a hospital, and had the wounded carried there that their wounds might receive attention. Unfortunately, Cavalier was soon obliged to quit the forest in spite of his hopes of being left in peace, for one day on his way back from a visit to the wounded in the cave, whose existence was a secret, he came across 100 miquelets, who had penetrated thus far, and who would have taken him prisoner if he had not, with his accustomed presence of mind and courage, sprung from a rock 20 feet high. The miquelets fired at him, but no bullet reached him. Cavalier rejoined his troops, but fearing to attract the rest of the royalists to the place, retreated to some distance from the cave. as it was of the utmost importance that it should not be discovered, since it contained all his resources. Cavalier had now reached one of those moments when fortune, tired of conferring favours, turns her back on her favourite. The royalists had often noticed an old woman from the village of Haizé going towards the forest, sometimes carrying a basket in her hand, sometimes with a hamper on her head, and it occurred to them that she was supplying the hidden Camisards with provisions. She was arrested and brought before General Lalande, who began his examination by threatening that he would have her hanged if she did not at once declare the object of her frequent journeys to the forest without reserve. At first, she made use of all kinds of pretexts, which only strengthened the suspicions of Lalande, who, ceasing his questions, ordered her to be taken to the gallows and hanged. The old woman walked to the place of execution with such firm step that the general began to think he would get no information from her, but at the foot of the ladder her courage failed. She asked to be taken back before the general, and having been promised her life, she revealed everything. End of chapter 3, section 1. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 3, Part 2 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 2, The Massacres of the South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 2, The Massacres of the South by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 3, Part 2. Monsieur de Lalande put himself at once at the head of a strong detachment of miquelets, and forced the woman to walk before them till they reached the cavern, which they never would have discovered without a guide, so cleverly was the entrance hidden by rocks and brushwood. On entering, the first thing that met their eye was the wounded, about 30 in number. The miquelets threw themselves upon them and slaughtered them. This deed accomplished, they went farther into the cave, which to their great surprise contained 1,000 things they never expected to find there: heaps of grain, sacks of flour, barrels of wine, casks of brandy, quantities of chestnuts and potatoes, and besides all this, chests containing ointments, drugs, and lint, and lastly a complete arsenal of muskets, swords, and bayonets, a quantity of powder ready made, and sulphur, saltpetre, and charcoal, in short, everything necessary for the manufacture of more, down to small mills to be turned by hand. Lalande kept his word. The life of an old woman was not too much to give in return for such a treasure. Meantime, M. de Villars, as he had promised, took up Baron d'Aguilar's in passing through Lyon, so that during the rest of the journey the peacemaker had plenty of time to expatiate on his plans. As M. de Villars was a man of tact and a lover of justice, and desired above all things to bring a right spirit to bear on the performance of the duties of his new office, in which his two predecessors had failed, he promised the Baron to keep, as he expressed himself, his 2 ears open and listen to both sides, and as a first proof of impartiality he refused to give any opinion until he had heard M. de Julien, who was coming to meet him at Tournon. When they arrived at Tournon, M. de Julien was there to receive them, and had a very different story to tell from that which M. de Villars had heard from d'Aguilar. According to him, the only pacific ration possible was the complete extermination of the Camisards. He felt himself very hardly treated in that he had been allowed to destroy only 400 villages and hamlets in the upper Cevennes, assuring de Villars, with the confidence of a man who had studied the matter profoundly, that they should all have been demolished without exception, and all the peasants killed to the last man. So it came to pass that M. de Villars arrived at Beaucaire, placed like Don Juan between the spirits of good and evil, the one advising clemency and the other murder. M. de Villars, not being able to make up his mind on reaching Nimes, d'Aguilar's assembled the principal Protestants of the town, told them of his plan, showing them its practicability, so that also joined in the good work, and drew up a document in which they asked the Marechal to allow them to take up arms and march against the rebels, as they were determined either to bring them back into the good way by force of example, or to fight them as a proof of their loyalty. This petition, which was signed by several nobles and by almost all the lawyers and merchants of the city of Nimes, was presented to M. de Villars on Tuesday, 22nd April, 1704, by M. d'Albenas, at the head of 700 or 800 persons of the Reformed religion. M. de Villars received the request kindly, thanked its bearer and those who accompanied him, assuring them that he had no doubt of the sincerity of their professions, and that if he were in want of help he would have recourse to them with as much confidence as if they were old Catholics. He hoped, however, to win the rebels back by mildness, and he begged them to second his efforts in this direction by spreading abroad the fact that an amnesty was offered to all those who would lay down arms and return to their houses within a week. The very next day but one, M. de Villars set out from Nimes to visit all the principal towns in order to make himself acquainted with men, things and places. Although the answer to the petition had been a delicate refusal, d'Aygaliers was not discouraged, but followed M. de Villars everywhere. When the latter arrived at Alais, the new governor sent for MM. de Lalande and de Baville, in order to consult them as to the best means of inducing the Camisards to lay down their arms. Baron d'Aygaliers was summoned to this consultation, and described his plan to the two gentlemen. As he expected, both were opposed to it. However, he tried to bring them over to his side by presenting to them what seemed to him to be cogent reasons for its adoption. But de Lalande and de Baville made light of all his reasons, and rejected his proposals with such vehemence that the marechal, however much inclined to the side of d'Aygaliers, did not venture to act quite alone, and said he would not decide on any course until he reached Uzes. d'Aygaliers saw clearly that until he had obtained the approbation of either the general or the intendant, he would get nothing from the marechal. He therefore considered which of the two he should try to persuade, and although de Baville was his personal enemy, having several times shown his hatred for him and his family, he decided to address himself to him. In consequence, the next day, to the great astonishment of M. de Baville, d'Aygaliers paid him a visit. The intendant received him coldly but politely, asked him to sit down, and when he was seated begged to know the motive which had brought him. "Sir," replied the baron, "you have given my family and me such cause of offence that I had come to the firm resolution never to ask a favour of you, and as perhaps you may have remarked during the journey we have taken with M. le Marechal, I would rather have died of thirst than accept a glass of water from you. But I have come here today not upon any private matter to obtain my own ends, but upon a matter which concerns the welfare of the state. I therefore beg you to put out of your mind the dislike which you have to me and mine, and I do this the more earnestly that your dislike can only have been caused by the fact that our religion is different from yours, a thing which could neither have been foreseen nor prevented. My entreaty is that you do not try to set M. le Marechal against the course which I have proposed to him, which I am convinced would bring the disorders in our province to an end, stop the occurrence of the many unfortunate events which I am sure you look on with regret, and spare you much trouble and embarrassment." The intendant was much touched by this calm speech, and above all by the confidence which M. d'Aygaliers had shown him, and replied that he had only offered opposition to the plan of pacification because he believed it to be impracticable. M. d'Aygaliers then warmly pressed him to try it before rejecting it forever, and in the end M. de Baville withdrew his opposition. M. d'Aygaliers hastened to the marechal, who, finding himself no longer alone in his favourable opinion, made no further delay, but told the baron to call together that very day all the people whom he thought suitable for the required service, and desired that they should be presented to him the next morning before he set out for Nimes. The next day, instead of the 50 men whom the marechal had thought could be gathered together, d'Aygaliers came to him followed by 80, who were almost all of good and many of noble family. The meeting took place by the wish of the baron in the courtyard of the episcopal palace. This palace, says the baron in his memoirs, which was of great magnificence, surrounded by terraced gardens and superbly furnished, was occupied by Monseigneur Michel Poncet de la Riviere. He was a man passionately devoted to pleasures of all kinds, especially to music, women, and good cheer. There were always to be found in his house good musicians, pretty women, and excellent wines. These latter suited him so well that he never left the table without being in a pleasant humour, and at such a moment if it came into his head that anyone in his diocese was not as good a Christian as himself, he would sit down and write to M. de Baville, urging that the delinquent ought to be sent into exile. He often did this honour to my late father. M. d'Aygaliers goes on to say that, on seeing such a great number of Huguenots in the court, who were all declaring that they were better servants of the king than the Catholics, he almost fell from his balcony with vexation and surprise. This vexation increased when he saw M. de Villars and M. de Baville, who had apartments in the palace, come down into the court and talk to these people. One hope still remained to him. It was that the marechal and the intendant had come down to send them away, but this last hope was cruelly disappointed when he heard M. de Villars say that he accepted their service and expected them to obey d'Aygaliers in all matters concerning the service of the king. But this was not all that had to be accomplished. Arms were necessary for the Protestants, and though their numbers was not great, there was a difficulty in finding them weapons. The unfortunate Calvinists had been disarmed so often that even their table knives had been carried off, so it was useless to search their houses for guns and sabres. d'Aygaliers proposed that they should take the arms of the townspeople, but M. de Villars considered that it would offend the Catholics to have their arms taken from them and given to the Protestants. In the end, however, this was the course that had to be adopted. M. de Paratte was ordered to give 50 muskets and the same number of bayonets to M. d'Aygaliers, who also received, as the reward of his long patience from M. de Villars, before the latter left for Nimes, the following commission: We, Marechal de Villars, general in the armies of the king, etc., etc., have given permission to M. d'Aygaliers, nobleman and Protestant of the town of Uzes, and to 50 men chosen by him to make war on the Camisards. Signed, Villars. Given at Uzes, the 4th of May, 1704. Hardly had M. de Villars set out for Nimes than d'Aygaliers met with fresh difficulties. The bishop, who could not forget that his episcopal palace had been turned into barracks for Huguenots, went from house to house threatening those who had promised to countenance d'Aygaliers' plans, and strictly forbidding the captains of the town troops to deliver any weapons to the Protestants. Fortunately, d'Aygaliers had not accomplished so much without having learned not to draw back when the road grew rough, so he also on his side went about confirming the strong and encouraging the feeble, and called on M. de Paratte to beg him to carry out the orders of M. de Villars. De Paratte was happily an old soldier whose one idea was that discipline should be maintained, so that he gave the guns and bayonets to d'Aygaliers on the spot, without a word of objection, and thus enabled the latter to start at 5 o'clock next morning with his little band. Meantime, de Baville and de Lalande had been reflecting what great influence d'Aygaliers would gain in the province should he succeed in his aims, and their jealousy made them resolve to forestall him in his work, by themselves inducing Cavalier to abandon his present course. They did not conceal from themselves that this would be difficult, but as they could command means of corruption which were not within the power of d'Aygaliers, they did not despair of success. They therefore sent for a countryman called Lacombe, in order to enlist him on their side. For Cavalier, when a boy, had been his shepherd for 2 years, and both had remained friends ever since. This man undertook to try and bring about a meeting between the 2 gentlemen and Cavalier, an enterprise which would have been dangerous for anyone else. He promised first of all to explain to Cavalier the offers of Messieurs de Baville and de Lalande. Lacombe kept his word. He set off the same day, and 2 days later appeared before Cavalier. The first feeling of the young chief was astonishment, the second pleasure. Lacombe could not have chosen a better moment to speak of peace to his former shepherd. Indeed, says Cavalier in his memoirs, the loss which I had just sustained in Naga was doubly painful to me because it was irreparable. I had lost at one blow not only a great number of weapons, all my ammunition, and all my money, but also a body of men inured to danger and fatigue, and capable of any undertaking. Besides all this, I had been robbed of my stores, a loss which made itself felt more than all the others put together, because as long as the secret of the cavern was kept, in all our misfortunes we were never without resources, but from the moment it got into the possession of our enemies, we were quite destitute. The country was ravaged, my friends had grown cold, their purses were empty, 100 towns had been sacked and burned, the prisons were full of Protestants, the fields were uncultivated. Adding to all this, the long-promised help from England had never arrived, and the new Marechal had appeared in the province accompanied by fresh troops. Nevertheless, in spite of his desperate position, Cavalier listened to the propositions laid before him by Lacombe with cold and haughty front, and his reply was that he would never lay down arms till the Protestants had obtained the right to the free exercise of their religion. Firm as was this answer, Lalande did not despair of inducing Cavalier to come to terms. He therefore wrote him a letter with his own hand, asking him for an interview and pledging his word that if they came to no agreement, Cavalier should be free to retire without any harm being done him, but he added that if he refused this request, he should regard him as an enemy to peace, and responsible for all the blood which might be shed in the future. This overture, made with a soldier's frankness, had a great effect on Cavalier, and in order that neither his friends nor his enemies should have the least excuse for blaming him, he resolved to show everyone that he was eager to seize the first chance of making peace on advantageous terms. He therefore replied to Lalande that he would come to the bridge of Avesnes on that very day, the 12th May, at noon, and sent his letter by Catinat, ordering him to deliver it into the hands of the Catholic general himself. Catinat was worthy of his mission. He was a peasant from Caille, whose real name was Abdia Morel. He had served under Marshal Catinat in Italy, the same who had maintained so gallant a struggle against Prince Eugene. When Morel returned home he could talk of nothing but his marshal and his campaigns, so that he soon went among his neighbours by the name of Catinat. He was, as we have seen, Cavalier's right hand, who had placed him in command of his cavalry, and who now entrusted him with a still more dangerous post, that of envoy to a man who had often said that he would give 2,000 livres to him who would bring him the head of Cavalier, and 1,000 livres each for the heads of his 2 lieutenants. Catinat was quite well aware of this offer of Lalande's, yet he appeared before the general perfectly cool and calm, only, either from a feeling of propriety or of pride, he was dressed in full uniform. The bold and haughty expression of the man who presented Cavalier's letter astonished the general, who asked him his name. "I am Catinat," he answered. "Catinat!" exclaimed Lalande in surprise. "Yes, Catinat, commander of the cavalry of Cavalier." "What?" said Lalande. "Are you the Catinat who massacred so many people in Beaucaire?" "Yes, I am. I did it, but it was my duty." "Well," exclaimed Monsieur de Lalande, "you show great hardihood and daring to appear before me." "I came," said Catinat proudly, "trusting to your honour and to the promise that Brother Cavalier gave me that nothing should happen to me." "He was quite right," returned Lalande, taking the letter. Having read it, he said, "Go back to Cavalier and assure him that I shall be at the bridge of Avesnes at noon, accompanied only by a few officers and 30 dragoons. I expect to find him there with a similar number of men." "But," answered Catinat, "it is possible that Brother Cavalier may not wish to come with so poor a following." "If so," returned Lalande, "then tell him that he may bring his whole army if he likes, but that I shall not take a single man with me more than I have said. As Cavalier has confidence in me, I have confidence in him." Catinat reported Lalande's answer to his chief. It was of a kind that he understood and liked, so leaving the rest of his troops at Massanes, he chose 60 men from his infantry and 8 horsemen as escort. On coming in sight of the bridge, he saw Lalande approaching from the other side. He at once ordered his 60 men to halt, went a few steps farther with his 8 horsemen, and then ordered them in their turn to stop, and advanced alone toward the bridge. Lalande had acted in the same manner with regard to his dragoons and officers, and now dismounting came toward Cavalier. The two met in the middle of the bridge and saluted with the courtesy of men who had learned to esteem each other on the field of battle. Then, after a short silence, during which they examined each other, Lalande spoke. "Sir," said he, "the king in his clemency desires to put an end to the war which is going on between his subjects, and which can only result in the ruin of his kingdom. As he knows that this war has been instigated and supported by the enemies of France, he hopes to meet no opposition to his wishes among those of his subjects who were momentarily led astray, but to whom he now offers pardon." "Sir," answered Cavalier, "the war not having been begun by the Protestants, they are always ready for peace, but a real peace without restriction or reserve. They have no right, I know, to lay down conditions, but I hope they will be permitted to discuss those which may be laid down for them. Speak openly, sir, and let me know what the offers are that you have been authorized to make to us, that I may judge if we can accept them." "But how would it be," said Lalande, "if you were mistaken, and if the king desired to know what conditions you would consider reasonable?" "If that is so," answered Cavalier, "I will tell you our conditions at once, in order not to prolong the negotiations, for every minute's delay, as you know, costs someone his life or fortune." "Then tell me what your conditions are," returned Lalande. "Well," said Cavalier, "our demands are three: first, liberty of conscience; secondly, the release of all prisoners who have been condemned to imprisonment or the galleys because of their religion; and thirdly, that if we are not granted liberty of conscience, we may be at least permitted to leave the kingdom." "As far as I can judge," replied Lalande, "I do not believe that the king will accept the first proposition, but it is possible that he may accede to the third. In that case, how many Protestants would you take with you?" 10,000 of all ages and both sexes." "The number is excessive, sir. I believe that His Majesty is not disposed to go beyond 3,000. "Then," replied Cavalier, "there is nothing more to be said, for I could not accept passports for any smaller number, and I could accept for the 10,000 only on condition that the king would grant us 3 months in which to dispose of our possessions and withdraw from the country without being molested. Should His Majesty, however, not be pleased to allow us to leave the kingdom, then we beg that our edicts be re-enacted and our privileges restored, whereupon we shall become once more what we were formerly, His Majesty's loyal and obedient servants." "Sir," said Lalande, "I shall lay your conditions before Monsieur le Marechal, and if no satisfactory conclusion can be arrived at, it will be to me a matter of profound regret. And now, sir, will you permit me to inspect more closely the gallant men with whose help you have done such astounding deeds?" Cavalier smiled, for these gallant men, when caught, had been broken on the wheel, burnt at the stake, or hanged like brigands. His sole answer was an inclination of the head as he turned and led the way to his little escort. Monsieur de Lalande followed him with perfect confidence, then passing by the 8 horsemen who were grouped on the road, he walked up to the infantry, and taking out of his pocket a handful of gold, he scattered it before them, saying, "There, my men, that is to drink the king's health with." Not a man stooped to pick up the money, and one of them said, shaking his head, "It is not money we want, but liberty of conscience." "My men," answered Lalande, "it is unfortunately not in my power to grant your demand, but I advise you to submit to the king's will and trust in his clemency." "Sir," answered Cavalier, "we are all ready to obey him, provided that he graciously grant us our just demands. If not, we shall die weapon in hand rather than expose ourselves once more to such outrages as have already been inflicted on us." "Your demands shall be transmitted word for word to Monsieur de Villars, who will lay them before the king," says Lalande, "and you may be sure, sir, that my most sincere wish is that His Majesty may not find them exorbitant." With these words, Monsieur de Lalande saluted Cavalier, and turned to rejoin his escort, but Cavalier, wishing to return confidence with confidence, crossed the bridge with him and accompanied the general to where his soldiers had halted. There, with another salute, the two chiefs parted, Monsieur de Lalande taking the road to Uzes, while Cavalier rejoined his comrades. Meantime, d'Aygaliers, who, as we have seen, had not left Uzes until the 5th of May, in order to join Cavalier, did not come up with him until the 13th, that is to say the day after his conference with Lalande. D'Aiguillers gives us an account of their interview, and we cannot do better than quote it. Although it was the first time that we had met face to face, we embraced each other as if we were old acquaintances. My little band mixed with his and sang psalms together, while Cavalier and I talked. I was very much pleased with what he said, and convinced him without difficulty that he should submit for the sake of the brethren, who could then choose whichever course best suited them, and either leave the kingdom or serve the king. I said that I believed the last course to be the best, provided we were allowed to worship God according to our consciences, because I hoped that, seeing their faithful service, His Majesty would recognize that he had been imposed upon by those who had described us as disloyal subjects, and that we should thus obtain for the whole nation that liberty of conscience which had been granted to us, that in no other way, as far as I could see, could our deplorable condition be ameliorated. For although Cavalier and his men might be able to exist for some time longer in the forests and mountains, they would never be strong enough to save the inhabitants of towns and other enclosed places from perishing. Upon this, he replied that although the Catholics seldom kept a promise made to those of our religion, he was willing to risk his life for the welfare of his brethren and the province, but that he trusted, if he confided in the clemency of the king, for whom he had never ceased to pray, no harm would happen to him. Thereupon d'Aiguillers, delighted to find him so well inclined, begged him to give him a letter for M. de Villars, and as Cavalier knew the marechal to be loyal and zealous, and had great confidence in him, he wrote without hesitation the following letter: Monseigneur, permit me to address your Excellency in order to beg humbly for the favour of your protection for myself and for my soldiers. We are filled with the most ardent desire to repair the fault which we have committed by bearing arms not against the king, as our enemies have so falsely asserted, but to defend our lives against those who persecuted us, attacking us so fiercely that we believed it was done by order of His Majesty. We know that it was written by St. Paul that subjects ought to submit themselves to their king, and if, in spite of these sincere protestations, our sovereign should still demand our blood, we shall soon be ready to throw ourselves on his justice or his mercy. But we should, Monseigneur, regard ourselves as happy if His Majesty, moved by our repentance, would grant us his pardon and receive us into his service, according to the example of the God of mercy whose representative His Majesty is on earth. We trust, Monseigneur, by our faithfulness and zeal to acquire the honour of your protection, and we glory in the thought of being permitted, under the command of such an illustrious and noble-minded general as yourself, to shed our blood for the king. This being so, I hope that your Excellency will be pleased to allow me to inscribe myself with profound respect and humility, Monseigneur, your most humble and obedient servant, Cavalier. D'Aiguillers, as soon as he got possession of this letter, set out for Nimes in the best of spirits, for he felt sure that he was bringing M. de Villars more than he had expected, and indeed, as soon as the marechal saw how far things had gone in spite of everything that Lalande could say, who in his jealousy asserted that d'Aiguillers would spoil everything, he sent him back to Cavalier with an invitation to come to Nimes. D'Aiguillers set out at once, promising to bring the young chief back with him, at which Lalande laughed loudly, pretending to be very much amused at the baron's confident way of speaking, and protesting that Cavalier would not come. In the meantime, events were happening in the mountains which might easily have changed the state of mind of the young chief. The Comte de Tournon, who was in command at Floret, had encountered Roland's army in the plain of Font-Mort, and had lost 200 men, a considerable sum of money, and 80 mules loaded with provisions. The anxiety which this news caused to M. de Villars was soon relieved, for 6 days after the defeat he received a letter from Cavalier by the hands of Lacombe, the same who had brought about the interview on the bridge of Avesnes. In this letter Cavalier expressed the greatest regret for what had just happened. D'Aiguillers therefore found Cavalier in the best of humours when he joined him at Tarnac. The first feeling that the young chief felt on receiving the invitation was one of stupefaction, for an interview with the marechal was an honour so unexpected and so great that his impression was that some treason lay behind it. But he was soon reassured when he recalled the character for loyalty which the marechal bore, and how impossible it was that d'Aygaliers should lend himself to treachery. So Cavalier sent back word that he would obey the marechal's orders, and that he put himself entirely into his hands in what concerned the arrangements for the interview. M. de Villars let him know that he would expect him on the 16th in the garden of the convent of the Recollets of Nimes, which lay just outside the city between the gates of Beaucaire and the Madeleine, and that Lalande would meet him beyond Carayrac to receive him and to bring him hostages. End of chapter 3, section 2. Reading by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.